Trigger warning. I am going to be preaching today out of the Bible, which is a book full of stories about violent deaths and dead people getting up and walking around the earth, and it is disturbing. So if you need to check out or, take your children, I don't actually see kids. That's good. All right. So got to start with a question. Does anyone here know what it feels like to need to be rescued? Do your grades need a rescue? Does your sleep schedule need a rescue? Does your institution need a rescue? Does your mind need a rescue from the endless striving of theological questions that maybe we'll never find an answer? Does your heart need a rescue from its aching pain today? Does your soul need a rescue from pretending it knows what it's doing here when it really has no clue? That's kind of how I was at seminary. Does your family need a rescue from dysfunction and addiction? Does your immigration status need a rescue? Does anybody here today know what it feels like to need a rescue? The world watched this June with bated breath as 12 boys, members of the Wild Boars soccer team, and their coach were trapped inside a cave in Thailand on a field trip gone wrong. The coach had planned to take the boys caving for an hour as a special treat. Now, I think this is one of those special treats, kind of like when God calls someone to be a prophet to Israel, special treat. That kind, where you think you're up for something good and it all goes wrong in an hour. So monsoon season was supposed to be a week away, but the boys found themselves an hour into this caving expedition, and suddenly a flash flood hit, and the entranceway to the cave that was supposed to be their only exit was a river, a deep river flowing fast, and these boys did not know how to swim. Can you imagine the horror of being that coach, knowing that you had unwittingly perhaps led 12 children to their untimely end? Fortunately, there were cell phones in the group, and once the news of their entrapment got out, a tent city sprung upside with rescue workers, parents, journalists from all over the world. One group brought in pumps and tried starting to pump out the water, but the rainwater was coming in too fast. Others scoured the mountainside for secret entrances that maybe no one knew about yet, to no avail. 2 experienced cave divers from England flew in and offered to scope things out. The water was cold and thick with mud, and they could barely see as they swam up current for 2 miles. Running low on oxygen, they were ready to give up when they found an air pocket, surfaced, and nearly died from the stench of 13 people who'd been trapped in a very small space with no bathroom. Fortunately, the stench was their hope. They knew they were close. And when they found the cavern where those boys and their coach were huddled, many of them were too weak to move. It had been 10 days without food, and their only water had been the rainwater dripping from the top of the cave. The next morning, a team of Thai Navy SEALs set out, including a doctor. Following the guideline the Englishmen had left them in the cave walls, they brought the survivors some food and promised to stay with them while the outsiders tried to create a real rescue plan. But here was the problem. What would it be? One argued that maybe we should just wait it out, just keep supplying them with food and just wait the monsoon season out. But that was going to be months. And inside the cave, the oxygen was growing thinner and thinner as the boys took shallower and shallower breaths. Another pushed for tunneling through the mountain, a half mile of rock, without any guarantee that they would end up in the right place. Finally, they came up with a better rescue plan of lugging extra scuba equipment with a small team of divers. They would bring masks, oxygen tanks, sedatives, and stretchers to carry the boys out. See, the boys didn't know how to swim, and often what happens in these cave rescues is that people just start to panic and flail, and then they can't be rescued. So these non-medical professionals were going to have to sedate the boys multiple times throughout the hours-long journey out of this cave. The risks were obviously high. One rescuer did die. Another barely survived electrocution. as much of the waterlogged cave was full of lights and power lines. Passageways were tight, especially maneuvering stretchers. The trip took hours. On July 18th, 18 brave rescuers set out. The boys chose who would go first. The first day, 4 came out. The next day, another 4. And the final day, 4 boys and their coach. And then finally, the Thai SEALs came out too. All in all, this horror had taken 19 days while the world watched. One boy described seeing those first 2 English divers appear. It happened in the evening, he told the news conference. Apparently he had a watch that told him what time of day it was, because you lose track of that in a cave pretty fast. It happened in the evening. We heard people speaking. We weren't sure if it was a hallucination, so then we were quieter and realized it was real. Does anyone here know what it feels like to really wait for a rescue? To sit in agonizing quiet, hoping against hope that you won't be forgotten. To feel like when hope shows up, it's probably a hallucination. If that's the case, you're in great company with these Thai boys and their experience of waiting. But you're actually not in good company with the characters in our Bible story today. See, the Thai cave rescue in all its drama pales in comparison to the rescue described by today's passage. 1 Peter is not talking about the kind of close call where human beings can band together and do their absolute best work and save each other's lives. No, this passage describes something far more horrifying. Peter tells us that Christ was put to death in the flesh but made alive in the spirit, and made proclamation preached to disobedient spirits imprisoned from the time of Noah. He references this again in chapter 4, saying that Christ preached the gospel to those who are now dead. This passage is talking about Jesus diving down deep into the cave of our worst hells, not to living, breathing, resilient children, but proclaiming the gospel to dead people. In the Thai cave rescue, there was a little bit of politics. The government didn't want the first image to come out of this rescue to be of a dead child. And so there was a lot of drama about, okay, well, we've got to make sure that the first one they attempt to bring out is like the strongest child. But the children decided otherwise. Jesus dives in and brings out that dead child. Let's draw this distinction between rescuing dead people and still alive people. Maybe some of you have seen The Princess Bride. I'm sure most people have seen The Princess Bride. And there's this part where the hero of the story, Wesley, is maybe dead, looks dead. He's been tortured for a while, and his little entourage has taken him to someone called Miracle Max, who has a reputation for being able to bring back dead people and perform other miracles. And Miracle Max says, so why do you want to raise this guy from the dead? He probably owes you some money, huh? And Inigo Montoya says, he's dead. He can't talk. Whoa, look who knows so much, says Miracle Max. It just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Mostly dead is still slightly alive. With all dead, well, there's only one thing you can do. What's that? Go through his clothes and look for loose change. In the scenario of mostly dead or all dead, I want to make it clear, Christ comes to preach good news to the all dead. In our passage, this is talked about with this key phrase, imprisoned spirits. Esoteric language here. And I am not going to pit centuries of Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant theologians over what exactly is this passage talking about with imprisoned spirits, because there's been a lot of ink spilled over this. Is it souls in limbo? Is it some saintly souls from the Old Testament that were waiting for Christ prophetically? Is it some group specific to the time of Noah? Is it all human beings that were living at the time of Christ's death? You know, these interpretations are interesting possibilities to play with on this playground that is the landscape of Scripture, rife for imaginative forays. And church history is a great companion in that exploration, but what is important, more important than having a theory about how this passage works, is the way your heart receives the word about spirits in prison and what Christ does for them. These lost souls, whom the non-believers at the time of Noah represent, these spirits to whom Christ comes and preaches good news. As Frank mentioned, I work in a hospital, a few hospitals in Boston, one of which is a high-level trauma hospital, and so we see a lot of people die. And death is always hard, and seeing families crying and in pain is always hard. But there's a particular kind of death that as a chaplain, I really have a tough time processing. And that's when somebody dies alone. When someone is estranged from their family members, when for whatever reason their life has been such that they have no friends at end of life, that nobody shows up to claim the body. And when that happens, the body just goes down into the hospital morgue in the basement, and it lies there in a body bag for several months, and eventually the city of Boston, if no one has claimed it, buries it in a mass grave. Can you imagine yourself as that soul, that lost, that alone? Can you imagine the horror of people in Noah's day when they realized they had literally missed the boat? Can you see yourself in them? I can. I can pretty easily imagine being there at the time of Noah, and this crazy guy has a word from God about a flood coming. I lived in Salem for a while, and Salem, Massachusetts, and during Halloween, there's some fundamentalist preachers that always come out with their sandwich boards, and they stand on the side of the street and yell at people in fun costumes about how they're gonna all go to hell. And most people laugh them off, some people get really offended and try to argue with them, but nobody takes these guys seriously. I think about the televangelists who tell us that if we just contribute to their building campaign, we'll get a quick ticket into heaven, or maybe we need to buy some apocalypse merch so that we'll be ready. Who among us doesn't laugh these people off? And who among us wouldn't laugh off Noah if we had been there? Who among us wouldn't have laughed until it began to rain, and even then until it began to pour, and even then until the floodwaters were coming and we realized this really might be real? Frankly, do any of us know what's good for us before we see it in the rearview mirror? Have any of us ever made the boat on time? Does anyone here know how it feels to be so flat on your back that the only word of worship you can utter is the silence of giving up all human hope? Peter gives us this incredible image of Jesus in the Spirit, showing up to a scene long after all human hope is over, kaput, dead, all dead. He doesn't come by midnight. He comes way after the carriage has turned into a pumpkin. It's not the 13th hour. It's not the 14th hour. It's not the 15th hour. He comes when the bodies have already been picked over for loose change, when the skeleton bones are brittle and white in the sand, buried in an unmarked grave, when the Titanic has sunk and all the treasure has already been looted. Just go with me for a second here in your imagination, even if this is kind of weird and wacky and you don't agree with my interpretation of the passage, but just go in your imagination to this horrible catastrophe that is the flood at the time of Noah, and you are the non-believer who missed the boat. We've all seen one too many newsreels of hurricanes and the devastation they cause, the floodwaters bringing houses off their hinges, bodies floating down streets that are now rivers, trees fallen, power lines down. And in some cultures, there's this notion that the way a person dies is the way their spirit will move forward in the afterlife. I think that's kind of an interesting image to play with, because I imagine these horror-stricken folks who die in this moment of trauma, of realizing they've made the biggest mistake of their lives, and they're just frozen in this regret, stuck in an eternal sense of loss. What scarier position could a human being be in? I know I'm sounding real dramatic, but maybe there's someone in this room today who feels like this, who feels as though they've been trapped in some kind of watery wasteland for thousands of years. Time just doesn't even make sense anymore. You've been watching other people find redemption in an ark headed toward a mountaintop, and you are drowning in your own life. And I want to say that in this worship space, you can be real about that. In fact, in the worship space is the only place you can be real about that. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's this odd little story, and it's another one of these just images I love to think about. And it's the moment that Jesus gives up his spirit on the cross. We know that the temple curtain is split in two, and then there's this line that a bunch of dead people popped up out of the grave and just started wandering around Jerusalem. I mean, imagine if Abraham just walked into your dinner party one night. It is so weird. It is so weird. This is like before Jesus rises from the dead. All these dead people just pop up and wander around. And I just have to wonder if there's a relationship between what 1 Peter is talking about, of Jesus and his spirit going and preaching to the dead, and then it's like a reaction. They can't experience the spirit of Jesus without coming out of their graves. So take yourself to that dark place, if you're willing, to that feeling of drownedness. And I want you to imagine there, as you're lying on the seafloor graveyard, that there is a motorboat a mile up on the surface of the sea, and Jesus is standing on the edge of that motorboat. He's wearing a wetsuit, he's got some flippers on his feet, he's got an oxygen tank strapped on, he's putting on a mask, and he's looking down where you are, lying so dead beyond anybody else's knowledge. And he's excited. Time's up. I'm coming down there and I'm bringing you back up with me. Imagine yourself being in that cold morgue, in that body bag, and no one is claiming your body. There is no soul in this universe that remembers you exist. And Jesus comes and knocks on the door. I'm coming for her. Bring out the body. Because there is a resurrection after drowning, after being all dead. The moments in your life where you feel like you're drowning, Peter's telling us that's your baptism, that life experience. It's not just the sprinkling with water, which we all know is a sacrament, a symbol of what's going on. The drowning in your life, that feeling of being all dead, that is your baptism. That is the moment before Jesus is going to dive in and bring you up to eternal life. And as Karis beautifully reminded us with the songs, this Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent. And this semester, this worship space, you guys have been celebrating the many forms of worship. And I think that we all know there's a connection between waiting and worship, that the Psalms are full of stories about being still and waiting for the Lord. And I just want to point out that there are some different types of waiting, all of which are part of our worship this Advent season. But I just kind of want to name some of the different places people in this room might be, and it's okay if there's a lot of difference here, and I might just be speaking to one or two of you, and that's okay. There's a type of waiting where you're watching and praying, you still have a little bit of hope, feels like you're dying, feels like you might be suffocating, but you're holding on, you're keeping the faith. You're suffering, but you know that this has meaning, and you are giving that to God as your act of worship. Every now and again, maybe you can croak out a praise song. And then there's a darker place of waiting. The place I've been talking about here with these imprisoned spirits. And I speak about this from both of these places of waiting personally. At different points in seminary, I could identify with both of these places. That's the place where you're alive in the flesh, but in your spirit, you really feel dead on the inside, or at least part of you does. Somewhere in your spirit, somewhere in your past, something has died. Maybe it's hope, maybe it's faith, maybe it's innocence, maybe your love for God feels kind of dead and you don't want to admit it. I don't know. Seminary may be the place that God brings you to show you how dead you really are. And if that's the case, today's passage is for you. Because the part of you that is all dead, that has been imprisoned for what feels like centuries in the powers of death, that's the part Jesus comes to preach to. That's the part that Jesus dives into hell for. That's the part that Jesus breaks into the morgue to save. Jesus will go to any length at any hour, no matter how lost any soul is, to come to the rescue. Jesus will come at the 25th hour. Jesus will come at the 125th hour. Jesus will come at the 1,000th hour. Dead body doesn't know the difference. But if you're so far gone past feeling like whenever God was supposed to show up, came and went and 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 came and went, and the grave robbers have not only taken your jewelry and your spare change, but they've taken your shoelaces, they've taken your elastic hairbands on your wrist, they've taken just about anything they could take, then you, my friend, are in the truest place of worship there is. You are flat on your back with nowhere to go. You are just about ready to be raised up. I truly believe that sometimes just lying on the ground and acting like a dead person is our truest form of worship. And I mean this quite literally, that if you need to just go and lie on your back all day long and just feel like a dead person, that is worship. And as someone who's struggled with mental illness, I want to be very clear that if someone in here is really depressed or suicidal, get help. This is not about isolating yourself, and I'm definitely not telling anybody to go just be alone. If you're sad, let us know. But I'm talking about a spiritual condition where you may feel shame about the fact that you just kind of feel dead inside. And I want to say there is no shame, because being a dead person is the person that Jesus comes and brings worship into your body. You don't bring worship out of your body. None of us here brings worship out of our own bodies. We are dead people on the ground, and Jesus is coming. He is diving into that hell. And he is coming to raise us up. Amen.